I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Greg's face. That manufactured smile couldn't hide the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes as he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Liam, thanks for coming in. HR is joining us shortly. 20 years at Meridian Technologies had taught me to read people well. The manila folder centered on his desk, the way his executive assistant avoided eye contact when I walked in, the calendar notification for a transition meeting, visible on his computer screen. All the signs were there. I sat down, straightening my tie out of habit. My hands didn't shake. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. We're implementing some organizational changes, Greg began, leaning back in his chair, a posture I recognized from his presentations when he was particularly pleased with himself. The executive team has been evaluating our operational structure, and we've determined that certain redundancies exist. The HR director, Melissa, entered without knocking and took a seat beside me, not across from me. Another tell. As part of this restructuring, Greg continued, sliding the folder toward me, we've made the difficult decision to eliminate your position, effective immediately. 20 years. 2 decades of solving impossible problems, saving the company millions, canceling family vacations to handle emergencies. All condensed into a sterile manila folder. I understand, I said, my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. I didn't understand, not really, but I knew enough about corporate politics to recognize a coup when I saw one. Greg seemed almost disappointed by my composure. He'd been with Meridian for only 8 months since the new CEO brought him in. Barely enough time to learn our systems, let alone evaluate their efficiency. Your severance package is quite generous, Melissa interjected, her voice softened with practiced sympathy. 6 months' salary, extended benefits, and outplacement services. I nodded, running my finger along the edge of the folder without opening it. And my team? Your team will report to me directly now, Greg said, unable to hide his triumph. We'll be implementing new processes that align better with our strategic direction. The new processes I'd proposed 3 months ago, no doubt. The ones Greg had dismissed as unnecessary complications before requesting all my documentation. You'll need to turn in your badge and laptop today, Melissa continued. We've arranged for IT to help you gather your personal items. The humiliation of being escorted out by security, the final indignity designed to break me. But I wouldn't break. Not here. Not in front of Greg. I stood up, straightening my jacket. I assume my access to the shared drives has already been revoked. A flicker of surprise crossed Greg's face. As of this morning, yes. Standard procedure. Of course. I extended my hand, forcing him to shake it. Good luck with the Patterson contract. The renewal terms are complicated. His smile faltered. He'd forgotten about Patterson, our largest client, whose complex contract negotiation was due next week. A negotiation I'd handled personally for the past 5 years. I walked out with my head high, past colleagues who averted their eyes, past the corner office where I'd solved countless crises, past the conference room where, just last year, the board had presented me with an award for operational excellence. Only in my car did I finally let out a long, shuddering breath. My phone vibrated with a text message from an unknown number. Liam, it's Walter Bennett. Board meeting was interesting today. Greg's presentation raised some flags. Call me when you can. I stared at the message from the board member who'd been my mentor years ago, and for the first time since walking into Greg's office, I smiled. My name is Liam Harrison. At 48, I'd spent the last 2 decades as the operations manager at Meridian Technologies, a mid-sized software solutions provider that had grown from a scrappy startup to a respected industry player. I'd been there since we occupied a single floor in a forgotten office park, through acquisitions, market crashes, and leadership changes. My role had evolved from managing a team of 5 to overseeing 63 employees across 3 departments. My specialty was efficiency, finding the waste in systems and eliminating it, streamlining processes until they hummed with precision. Numbers were my language. Last year alone, my team had reduced operational costs by 18.4%, saving Meridian $4.3 million. I parked outside my apartment building, Walter's text message still displayed on my phone. The board rarely intervened in day-to-day operations, but Walter had always taken a special interest in my department's metrics. We'd met monthly for coffee during his active CEO years, a practice we'd maintained even after his move to the board. Inside my apartment, I hung my jacket neatly in the closet, habit, even on the day you lose your job. The space reflected my methodical nature, minimal, organized, purposeful. My daughter called it aggressively tidy during her rare visits from college. I sat at my kitchen table and opened the severance folder, mentally cataloging the inconsistencies in Greg's reasoning. The redundancies he cited contradicted the expansion plans approved last quarter. The timing, just before the Patterson contract renewal, made little strategic sense. The truth was simpler. Greg felt threatened. He'd arrived with the new CEO, Jonathan Meyer, presenting himself as an operations visionary. But his ideas were recycled concepts from management books, lacking practical application in our specific industry. When several board members had publicly praised my quarterly presentation instead of his, something had shifted in his demeanor. My phone rang. "Walter, I'm sorry about today's events," he said without preamble. Jonathan informed the board after the fact. Claimed it was an operational decision within executive purview. "I appreciate the call," I replied, maintaining the even tone that had become my professional signature. Never too high, never too low. Emotions clouded judgment. "What did they tell you?" Walter asked. "Restructuring. Redundancies." My fingers traced the edge of the document. "Greg has been positioning for this since the Miller project. He needed someone to blame for the delays. Delays you documented as inevitable after his budget cuts," Walter noted. "I remember your risk assessment." I allowed myself a small smile. My risk assessments were legendary within Meridian, detailed, evidence-based, and unfortunately, often prophetic. "Jonathan seems convinced Greg is some kind of operational genius," Walter continued. "The board isn't as easily impressed. Your last efficiency report raised questions about the new direction. I'd spent 15 years building relationships across the company, from the maintenance team to the boardroom. Not through politics or manipulation, but through reliability. When I highlighted a problem, people listened because my track record spoke for itself." "What are your plans?" Walter asked after a moment. "I haven't decided." In truth, my phone had already lit up with messages from competitors who'd been trying to recruit me for years. "I need to think strategically. The board has a quarterly review next Thursday. Preliminary numbers look concerning." The subtext was clear. The changes Greg had implemented were showing negative effects already, but too little time had passed for him to blame anyone but himself. "How concerning?" I asked. "Patterson is threatening to review alternative vendors. Something about changes to their service agreement." I closed my eyes briefly. The Patterson account was worth 22% of our annual revenue. Their CEO, Maria Patterson, had insisted on a personal assurance from me before their last renewal. "That's unfortunate," I said, my mind already calculating variables, potential responses, likely outcomes. "It is," Walter agreed, particularly since Jonathan assured us that the operational changes wouldn't impact key client relationships. After we hung up, I methodically prepared dinner, a single portion of perfectly measured ingredients. Control what you can control. My father, a civil engineer, had repeated this mantra throughout my childhood. As I ate, I reviewed my options. I could accept the severance, join a competitor, and move forward. The professional response. The expected response. Or I could draw on 20 years of institutional knowledge, detailed documentation, and board-level relationships to correct a serious corporate misstep. I wasn't angry. Anger was inefficient. I was focused. Greg had made a critical error in judgment. He'd seen me as a threat to eliminate rather than an asset to leverage. He'd been so focused on climbing that he'd failed to secure his foundation. I began making notes, precise, organized, thorough. Just as I'd approached every challenge in my career. The next morning, I established my home office with military precision. Laptop positioned for optimal ergonomics, notes arranged by priority, coffee brewed to the exact strength that maximized cognitive function. My corporate access might be gone, but 20 years of meticulous record-keeping meant I had what I needed. First, I called Maria Patterson. "Liam," she answered, surprise evident in her voice. "I just left a message with your office. Your assistant said you were unavailable." "I'm no longer with Meridian," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "As of yesterday." The silence that followed spoke volumes. "That explains a few things," she finally replied. "We received notification of streamlined service protocols yesterday afternoon. The changes nullify 3 of our negotiated exceptions. Exactly as I'd suspected. The exceptions were documented in the supplementary agreement, a section Greg had likely never reviewed." "What specific changes?" I asked, opening my personal copy of the Patterson agreement. As Maria detailed the modifications, I flashed back to 6 months earlier, when Greg first took interest in the Patterson account. "These custom protocols are inefficient," Greg had announced during a department meeting, projecting my service model onto the screen. "We're dedicating too many resources to one client." "The Patterson account represents 22% of our annual revenue," I'd explained calmly. "Their customized service level directly correlates to their renewal commitment." Greg had smiled that dismissive smile. "Times change, Liam. Modern operations require standardization." After the meeting, Ellen from my team had pulled me aside. He requested all the Patterson documentation last week. Seemed especially interested in the renewal clauses. Maria's voice pulled me back to the present. "Your replacement assured us these changes wouldn't impact service quality, but our technical team disagrees." "Greg isn't my replacement," I corrected gently. "He's been my supervisor for 8 months." "Interesting." He introduced himself as the new operations director, Maria said. He mentioned fresh approaches to our partnership several times. I made careful notes. Greg wasn't just eliminating me. He was rewriting history to claim my accomplishments. After the call, I systematically contacted 5 former team members who had left since Greg's arrival. Each conversation revealed similar patterns: marginalization of experienced staff, dismissal of established protocols, credit appropriation. Julie Chun, my former process analyst, was particularly illuminating. He demanded I change the efficiency metrics in the quarterly report, she said. When I refused, I was reassigned to server maintenance. I resigned the following week. Did you document the request? I asked. Of course. I sent you and HR an email detailing the interaction. An email I'd never received. Another piece of the puzzle. I spent the afternoon reconstructing a timeline of Greg's maneuvers, cross-referencing with project outcomes and financial impacts. The pattern became clear. Greg had been systematically undermining successful processes, then repositioning the inevitable failures as evidence of outdated methodologies, specifically my methodologies. At 4:15 p.m., my phone rang. Ellen, my former assistant. I shouldn't be calling, she began, her voice low. But you need to know, they're blaming you for the Miller project overrun. Greg presented a retroactive analysis to the executive team this morning. The Miller project, a complex system integration I'd warned would fail under Greg's compressed timeline. My recommendation had been documented in a 14-page impact analysis. Did he mention my risk assessment? I asked. He said your projections were excessively conservative, demonstrating resistance to innovation. Her voice carried a hint of anger. He's reframing your caution as obstruction. Who has access to the original documentation? That's why I'm calling. The shared drive was reorganized yesterday. Several folders were archived, including your project assessments. Not deleted, that would be too obvious. Archived where only someone with specific knowledge would think to look. Ellen, do you remember Project Phoenix from 2018? The disaster recovery protocol? Of course. Thank you, I said, the plan crystallizing in my mind. After we hung up, I accessed my personal cloud storage. Following the Turner Industries data breach 5 years earlier, I'd implemented a comprehensive documentation protocol. Every significant analysis, recommendation, and outcome was backed up in triplicate. 1 copy on Meridian servers, 1 copy with relevant stakeholders, and 1 personal archive for disaster recovery. Greg wouldn't know about this protocol. It had been implemented before his time and documented in a departmental guideline he dismissed as excessive paperwork. My personal archives contained everything: original project plans, risk assessments, meeting minutes, email chains. Most importantly, they included the board presentations highlighting the specific operational efficiencies that had saved Meridian millions, efficiencies Greg was now dismantling. The evidence was mounting, but I needed more than documentation. I needed to understand the full scope of the damage Greg had already caused. I reached out to Samuel in accounting, an old ally who had helped me implement cost-tracking measures years ago. The preliminary quarterly numbers are concerning, he confirmed. Customer retention has dropped 7%. Support tickets are up 34%. Response time has nearly doubled. All since the streamlining initiatives? The correlation is undeniable, Samuel replied. But Greg's presenting it as a temporary adjustment period. He's projecting significant savings next quarter once the legacy inefficiencies are fully removed. Legacy inefficiencies. My processes, my team, my results, all reframed as outdated problems rather than proven solutions. As evening fell, I reviewed the information I'd gathered. The picture was clearer than I'd anticipated. Greg hadn't just orchestrated my removal. He'd systematically positioned himself to take credit for my successes while creating a narrative that would blame me for his failures. What he couldn't have known was that I'd spent 20 years building systems designed to withstand not just technical failures, but human ones as well. I sent a message to Walter. I've identified some concerning patterns in recent operational changes. Would appreciate your perspective before Thursday's board review. His response came minutes later. Breakfast tomorrow, 7 a.m. The usual place. I closed my laptop, a sense of calm purpose replacing yesterday's shock. Greg believed he was building his career on the ruins of mine. He was about to learn a fundamental principle of sound operations. You can't build anything lasting on a compromised foundation. The cafe where Walter and I had shared monthly strategy sessions for years was just opening when I arrived. Walter sat at our usual corner table, 2 steaming cups already waiting. You look better than expected for someone who just lost a 20-year position, he observed as I sat down. I lost a job, not my abilities, I replied, placing a slim folder on the table. Or my documentation. Walter's eyes flicked to the folder. I'm listening. For the next 40 minutes, I methodically outlined my findings. The timeline of Greg's interference, the correlation between his improvements and declining metrics, the systematic repositioning of successful strategies as problematic legacy systems. Walter listened without interruption, occasionally noting something in his leather-bound planner. When I finished, he sat back. "This is concerning, but not entirely surprising," he said. "Several board members questioned the operational changes at last month's meeting. Jonathan assured us they were necessary modernizations with temporary adjustment costs." "The costs aren't temporary," I countered, sliding a graph across the table. "This projects customer retention if the current trajectory continues. By quarter's end, we'll lose 18% of our client base." Walter studied the projection. "And Patterson? They're preparing to trigger their satisfaction clause. If they leave, others will follow." He nodded slowly. "What does Greg gain from this? Deliberately tanking operations seems counterproductive to someone building a career." "He's not tanking operations, he's creating a crisis he plans to solve," I explained. "Look at this timeline. He dismantles proven systems, waits for inevitable problems, then introduces innovative solutions that essentially recreate what existed before with minor modifications and different terminology. Giving him credit for the recovery," Walter concluded. "Exactly. He's gambling that short-term disruption will be overlooked once he fixes the problems he created. Bold strategy. And it might have worked if he hadn't miscalculated in two critical areas." I tapped the folder. First, he assumed board members wouldn't connect the operational changes to declining performance. Second, he believed eliminating me would remove the institutional knowledge needed to expose his methods. Walter's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight nod, the same gesture he'd given when approving my first major process overhaul years ago. "The board meeting is tomorrow," he said. "Jonathan has allocated 30 minutes for Greg's operational review. What are you proposing?" I outlined my plan, emphasizing the need for verification and measured response rather than accusations. Walter asked precise questions, challenging assumptions, testing contingencies, exactly as he'd done throughout my career. "It's risky," he finally said. "Greg is Jonathan's support, and Jonathan controls the meeting agenda." "Risk assessment is my specialty," I reminded him. "The probability of success outweighs potential negative outcomes." As we parted, Walter extended his hand. "For what it's worth, several board members questioned your termination. Jonathan insisted it was an operational necessity, not a board matter." "It's about to become a board matter," I replied. My cautious optimism faded that afternoon when Ellen called again. "Greg's moving up the Patterson service transition," she said, her voice tight with stress. "Implementation starts tomorrow morning." Before the board meeting, I noted. "He's accelerating the timeline. There's more. He's called an all-hands meeting to announce reorganization of the entire operations department. Rumors are flying about additional terminations." I felt a pang of responsibility for the team I'd built, professionals who'd executed my vision with precision for years. "Stay focused," I advised her. "Document everything." After hanging up, I received a text from Samuel. "Financial projections for Q3 mysteriously revised upward this morning. Original forecasts temporarily unavailable due to system update." Greg was covering his tracks, eliminating evidence of negative impacts from his changes. He was moving faster than anticipated, leveraging his position to entrench his narrative before the board review. Then came the most significant setback. Walter called as evening approached. "Jonathan has rescheduled the board meeting to next week," he said without preamble. "Claims an urgent client matter requires his attention tomorrow." "Patterson," I said immediately. "He's giving Greg time to implement the service changes before the board can intervene." "Most likely. This complicates your timeline." It did more than complicate it, it potentially unraveled it. If Greg successfully implemented the Patterson changes, the damage might be irreversible before the board could act. "There's another option," Walter said after a moment. "The audit committee meets tomorrow morning. 3 board members, including myself. Our charter allows us to review any operational changes with potential financial impact. A narrow opening, but an opening nonetheless. Would Jonathan be present? No. He's handling the client matter. I considered the implications. A smaller forum might actually be more effective, focused discussion without Jonathan's interference. But it would require irrefutable evidence and precise timing. "I'll need to adjust my approach," I said. "The committee convenes at 9, Walter replied. "Materials should be submitted by 7 for review." After hanging up, I assessed the situation. Greg had accelerated his timeline, manipulated financial projections, and was preparing to implement changes that would potentially drive away our largest client. Jonathan had provided cover by delaying board oversight. The stakes had escalated beyond my personal situation. Meridian stability, client relationships built over decades, and the livelihoods of dozens of team members now hung in the balance. I spent the night preparing a focused presentation for the audit committee. While more limited than my original plan, It addressed the immediate financial risks of Greg's changes with supporting documentation from my archives. At 6:45 a.m., I submitted the materials to the committee secretary. At 7:30, I received a text from Ellen. Emergency executive meeting called. Greg presenting critical operational updates before regular schedule. Something about Patterson's situation requiring immediate action. He was moving even faster than I'd anticipated, positioning himself ahead of any potential intervention. At 8:15, Walter called. Jonathan has joined the audit committee meeting. Unusual, but within his authority. He's requesting we address an urgent operational matter before our regular agenda. Greg had somehow learned of my strategy and convinced Jonathan to intercept it. My carefully planned approach was unraveling. Should I still attend? I asked. Walter's response was measured. That would be appropriate. As the former operations manager with direct knowledge of the systems under discussion, your expertise would be relevant to the committee's assessment. A technical opening, carefully worded. Walter was providing me a path forward while maintaining proper governance protocols. As I drove to Meridian's headquarters, I recalibrated my strategy. The confrontation was happening earlier than planned, with additional opposition and in a more limited form. But I still had one advantage Greg couldn't counter. 20 years of building systems designed to withstand exactly this type of failure scenario. I had created Meridian's operational infrastructure with redundancies and safeguards, not just technical ones, but documentation and accountability measures that Greg hadn't bothered to understand before dismantling. He had seen these systems as obstacles to his advancement. He was about to discover they were actually the foundation supporting the entire company, including his position within it. Walking through Meridian's glass doors felt surreal after my abrupt departure days earlier. The security guard's confused expression as he processed my visitor badge spoke volumes. Mr. Harrison? Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Just here for a meeting, Tom, I replied, signing the visitor log with deliberate strokes. Conference room A, he said, checking his schedule. Audit committee, right? I nodded, noting the room change. The audit committee typically met in the smaller fourth-floor boardroom. Conference room A was larger, more formal, a venue for presentations rather than discussions. The elevator ride gave me precious moments to center myself. In the polished door reflection, I straightened my tie and assumed the expression I'd perfected over decades of high-stakes meetings. Confident but not aggressive, serious but not severe. When the doors opened, I immediately spotted Ellen at her desk, eyes widening at my appearance. They're already inside, she whispered as I passed. Greg brought his entire leadership team. A strategic show of force. I hadn't anticipated that. Who from the committee is present? I asked quietly. Walter, Davidson, and Chun. Plus Jonathan. The full committee plus the CEO. Good, more witnesses meant more accountability. Thank you, I said, then paused. Ellen, no matter what happens in there, you've done exceptional work. Her expression softened momentarily before professionalism reasserted itself. The blue binder on the credenza contains the original Patterson service agreement. Just in case someone needs to reference it. A small act of alliance that could prove significant. I took a deep breath and entered conference room A. The scene confirmed my assessment. Greg stood at the presentation screen, flanked by 3 senior managers he'd brought in since his arrival. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, with the committee members to his right. The arrangement created a visual power dynamic. Greg's team versus the committee, with Jonathan positioned as arbiter. Liam, Walter acknowledged with a professional nod. The committee felt your perspective would be valuable given your history with the operations systems under discussion. Before I could respond, Jonathan interjected. While we appreciate Mr. Harrison's past contributions, this meeting concerns current operational strategies, not historical contexts. Actually, Walter countered smoothly, the audit committee's charter specifically requires us to evaluate changes against established benchmarks. Mr. Harrison's direct knowledge of those benchmarks is relevant to our assessment. A procedural maneuver that Jonathan couldn't easily dismiss. Walter motioned to an empty chair at the table, not marginalized at the periphery, but positioned directly across from Greg. As I took my seat, I placed my notebook on the table and waited. Patience was my advantage here. Greg would feel compelled to fill the silence, to justify his position. People who rush to speak often reveal more than they intend. As I was explaining, Greg continued after an uncomfortable pause, the Patterson situation requires immediate intervention. Their outdated service model is creating unsustainable resource allocations. Outdated? Committee member Davidson raised an eyebrow. The last quarterly review showed Patterson's customized service protocol as one of our most efficient client relationships on a revenue-to-resource ratio. Greg's smile tightened. Those metrics failed to account for opportunity costs. My team has identified potential efficiency gains of 23% by standardizing their service structure. May I? I interjected, my voice calm but firm. All eyes turned to me. The Patterson Service Protocol was designed specifically to address their complex integration requirements. Their annual renewal has included a premium service fee that more than offsets the dedicated resources. I opened my notebook. The actual revenue-to-resource ratio, including the premium, shows a 34% higher efficiency than our standard service model. Those calculations are based on outdated methodology, Greg countered. Then perhaps you could share the updated methodology with the committee? I suggested, including the specific calculations supporting the 23% efficiency projection. Greg hesitated, exactly as anticipated. The projection was fabricated, with no substantive analysis behind it. The detailed analysis is still being finalized, he said, glancing at Jonathan. But the preliminary indicators are clear. The committee requires specific data for our risk assessment, Walter said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Jonathan shifted in his chair. Perhaps we should focus on the immediate concern, Patterson's request for service modifications. Precisely my point, Greg seized the opening. Their technical team has expressed frustration with the cumbersome protocols we inherited. My proposed streamlining addresses those concerns while optimizing our resource allocation. I felt a moment of doubt. Had I misread the situation? Was Patterson actually dissatisfied with the existing protocol? Then I remembered Ellen's parting gift. I stood and retrieved the blue binder from the credenza. This contains the original Patterson Service Agreement, I explained, opening to a tabbed section. Section 4.3 details the custom protocols they specifically requested, including the exact resource allocations they deemed essential for their operations. I placed the binder in front of Davidson. Furthermore, I continued, I spoke with Maria Patterson directly yesterday. Their concern isn't with the existing protocols, but with the proposed changes that would eliminate their negotiated exceptions. The room went still. Greg's expression shifted from confidence to calculation as he assessed this new variable. You contacted Patterson after your termination? Jonathan asked, his tone suggesting an impropriety. Maria contacted me, I clarified. She was surprised by my departure, particularly given the timing of their contract renewal. This is highly irregular, Jonathan began, but Davidson interrupted. What exactly did Patterson say about the proposed changes? I met Greg's gaze directly. They're prepared to trigger their satisfaction clause if the changes proceed. That would allow them to terminate their contract without penalty. Committee member Chin leaned forward. What financial impact would losing the Patterson account have? Immediate revenue reduction of 22%. I replied without hesitation. With potential downstream impacts on related service contracts that could push the total impact to nearly 30%. These are hypothetical scenarios, Greg interjected. My team has already discussed the transitions with Patterson's technical leads. They understand the adjustment period. Do you have documentation of those discussions? I asked. Minutes, emails, recorded calls confirming their acceptance of the service modifications? Greg's silence was answer enough. Walter turned to Jonathan. Given the potential financial implications, the audit committee recommends suspending any changes to the Patterson service model pending full review. Jonathan's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight tension in his jaw. He was reassessing the situation, calculating political capital against financial risk. That seems prudent, he finally agreed, turning to Greg. Let's pause the Patterson transition until we have more comprehensive data. Greg's smile had vanished completely. Of course, though I should note the delay may impact our quarterly efficiency targets. Better a missed target than a lost client, Davidson remarked dryly. As the meeting concluded, I remained outwardly composed while internally acknowledging the small victory. I had successfully halted Greg's immediate plans, but this was merely the opening move in a longer strategic sequence. Walter approached as the room cleared. That was precisely executed, he said quietly. But Jonathan won't appreciate being publicly checked. And Greg isn't finished. I'm counting on that, I replied. His response will determine my next steps. Walter studied me for a moment. You've always played the long game, Liam. What's your actual objective here? I considered my answer carefully. This wasn't about revenge or even personal vindication. It was about protecting systems I'd spent decades building, people I'd mentored, and a company I still believed in despite recent leadership missteps. Correction, I finally said. Not of individuals, but of course. Meridian deserves better than decisions based on personal advancement rather than sound operational principles. Walter nodded thoughtfully. The full board meets next week. Jonathan can't indefinitely postpone a comprehensive operational review, especially now that the audit committee has flagged potential financial risks. As I left the building, Ellen caught my eye from her desk and gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. Small alliances carefully maintained. Another operational principle Greg had never bothered to learn. In my car, I reviewed the morning's events with methodical precision. The immediate crisis had been averted, but Greg would regroup quickly. His position was now compromised. Jonathan would question his judgment, and the audit committee would scrutinize his future recommendations. Most people would respond to such setbacks with desperation, making rash decisions to regain lost ground. I was counting on Greg following this predictable pattern, creating openings for my next strategic moves. I didn't feel triumphant or vindictive. Those emotions clouded judgment. Instead, I felt the familiar clarity that came with executing a well-designed process, identifying variables, anticipating responses, adjusting parameters based on new information. Greg had tried to dismantle what I'd built. Now he would learn that true operational excellence wasn't about flashy presentations or ambitious projections. It was about fundamentals, relationships, and integrity, elements so deeply integrated into Meridian's systems that they couldn't be removed without consequences. I started my car, already mentally mapping the next phase of my response. This wasn't about saving my job anymore. It was about saving Meridian from the consequences of short-sighted leadership, and perhaps, in the process, creating something better than what had been lost. The following week unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. Greg, desperate to regain credibility, accelerated several other optimization initiatives without proper testing or documentation. Predictably, these hasty implementations created cascading issues across multiple departments. By Wednesday, support ticket volume had doubled. By Thursday, the development team was working overnight to patch critical system failures. By Friday morning, 3 additional clients had invoked service-level agreement clauses. I monitored these developments through my network of colleagues while preparing for the full board meeting. My approach needed to be strategic, not accusatory. This wasn't about personal vindication. It was about course correction for a company I had helped build for 2 decades. Saturday evening, Walter called. "Jonathan has expanded Monday's agenda to include a comprehensive operational review," he said. "Greg is scheduled for 90 minutes. He's positioning recent issues as transition challenges while promising significant improvements by quarter's end." Classic crisis management, I noted. Create a narrative that acknowledges visible problems while promising future benefits that can't be immediately verified. "The board isn't entirely convinced," Walter replied. "Several members have requested specific performance metrics comparing pre- and post-reorganization outcomes." I smiled slightly. Precisely the comparison Greg has been avoiding. "You're on the agenda immediately following Greg's presentation. 30 minutes for historical context and alternative operational perspectives. A limited window, but sufficient for my purpose." "One more thing," Walter added. "Maria Patterson contacted 3 board members directly yesterday. She's requesting assurance that her service protocols will remain intact. A significant development. Client escalation to board level represented a serious vote of no confidence in current management." "Thank you for the update," I said. "I'll be prepared." Throughout Sunday, I refined my presentation, focusing on data rather than personalities. My objective wasn't to attack Greg, but to illuminate the actual impact of his decisions through indisputable metrics. Monday morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt since my termination. As I entered the boardroom, I noted the shifting dynamics immediately. Board members were engaged in hushed conversations, reviewing documents with furrowed brows. Jonathan sat stiffly at the head of the table, his typically confident posture notably absent. Greg was already presenting, his usual polished delivery replaced by a more urgent, defensive tone. Behind him, slides filled with colorful graphs showed optimistic projections contradicting the actual performance data I knew the board had received. "These temporary disruptions," he was saying, gesturing to a minor dip in an otherwise ascending line, "represent standard adjustment patterns during organizational transformation. Our projections show full recovery and enhanced performance by next quarter." I took my seat quietly, observing rather than interrupting. Greg's presentation continued for another 40 minutes, increasingly reliant on future projections rather than current results. When he finally concluded, Board Chair Eliza Michaels leaned forward. "Thank you, Greg. Before we move to questions, we'd like to hear from Liam Harrison for historical context." I approached the presentation area with measured confidence, connecting my laptop to the display system. "Thank you for the opportunity to provide perspective," I began. "Rather than offering opinions or projections, I'd like to focus on measurable outcomes." My first slide displayed a simple comparison, key performance indicators before and after Greg's optimizations. The contrast was stark: client retention, response times, resolution rates, all showing significant deterioration. "These aren't opinions or projections," I continued. "These are actual performance metrics from Meridian's own tracking systems." I methodically walked through each major operational change, contrasting Greg's stated objectives with measurable outcomes. Not with accusation or vindictiveness, but with clinical precision. "The Patterson Protocol provides an illustrative case study," I explained, displaying the custom service framework I designed. This structure wasn't arbitrary complexity, as has been suggested. Each component addresses specific client requirements documented here. I highlighted the integration points that made Patterson's system unique and demonstrated how the proposed standardization would have compromised critical functionalities. Efficient operations aren't about applying universal templates, I concluded. They're about building systems that achieve optimal outcomes within specific contexts. Standardization is valuable where similarities exist, but counterproductive where they don't. Throughout my presentation, I noticed Jonathan shifting uncomfortably, while several board members nodded with growing recognition. When I finished, Chair Michaels spoke first. This presents a dramatically different picture than what we've been receiving in executive reports. Different interpretations of the same data, Jonathan suggested quickly. Not interpretations, Davidson countered. These are direct measurements from our own systems. What followed was 90 minutes of increasingly focused questioning. Board members pressed Greg on discrepancies between his projections and actual outcomes. Jonathan attempted to provide cover, but found himself caught in contradictions between his previous assurances and the documented reality. Finally, Chair Michaels called for a brief recess. As board members filed out, Walter remained behind. You presented the facts without attacking the individuals, he observed. Effective. Attacking Greg wouldn't solve the actual problem, I replied. The issue isn't his competence, it's his prioritization of personal advancement over operational integrity. Walter nodded thoughtfully. The board is discussing next steps. Jonathan has proposed bringing in external consultants to evaluate operations. An expensive solution to a misdiagnosed problem, I noted. Indeed. Walter studied me carefully. What would you propose instead? I considered my response. This moment wasn't about reclaiming my former position or exacting retribution. It was about finding the optimal path forward for a company I still cared deeply about. Meridian needs operational stability while developing more sustainable long-term structures, I said. That requires someone with institutional knowledge and client relationships, but positioned outside the current hierarchy to provide objective assessment. Walter's slight smile told me he'd already arrived at the same conclusion. When the board reconvened, their decision was announced with minimal ceremony. Greg would transition to a strategic projects role, effectively sidelined without the public embarrassment of termination. Jonathan remained CEO, but with enhanced board oversight of operational decisions. And I was offered a 6-month consulting contract to stabilize operations and develop transition plans for critical systems. This arrangement provides continuity for clients while creating space for organizational reassessment, Chair Michaels explained. It leverages Mr. Harrison's expertise without disrupting current reporting structures. The solution was elegant in its balance, addressing the immediate crisis without creating unnecessary upheaval. Greg kept his title but lost his authority. Jonathan saved face but received clear boundaries. And I gained the opportunity to protect what I'd built while establishing more robust systems for the future. As the meeting concluded, I felt no triumph over Greg's demotion or Jonathan's chastening. Victory wasn't about personal vindication. It was about restoring operational integrity and creating space for long-term success. I had entered the boardroom not seeking revenge, but resolution. And through patience, preparation, and principled action, that resolution had been achieved. 3 months into my consulting contract, Meridian's operational metrics had stabilized. The Patterson account remained secure, with Maria personally thanking me for restoring their customized protocols. For other clients who had been considering exits renewed their contracts after seeing demonstrable improvements in service levels. My temporary office, smaller than my former space but with a better view of the city skyline, had become a hub of activity. What began as a crisis management assignment had evolved into something more significant, a fundamental reassessment of how Meridian structured its operations. The board had extended my initial contract, expanding my role to include mentoring potential internal candidates who might eventually assume leadership positions. This arrangement suited me perfectly, influence without the bureaucratic constraints of corporate hierarchy. On a crisp autumn morning, Walter joined me for coffee on the building's terrace. The quarterly numbers exceeded projections, he noted, scanning the financial summary I'd prepared. Client retention is back to historical levels. The systems were always sound, I replied. They just needed proper maintenance and respect for their underlying principles. Walter smiled slightly. Greg has requested a transfer to the West Coast office. Jonathan approved it yesterday. I nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor resentment at this news. Greg's career trajectory was no longer my concern. And Jonathan? I asked, learning slowly. The board has implemented those governance protocols you recommended. Major operational decisions now require documented impact assessments and board review. Structural safeguards to prevent future impulsive changes, exactly what I'd hoped for. You could have approached this differently, Walter observed, setting down his cup. When Greg orchestrated your termination, you had enough connections to create a much more damaging scenario for him. That wouldn't have served anyone, I said simply. Especially not Meridian. The truth was more complex, of course. In those first days after my dismissal, I had indeed considered more aggressive responses. The evidence I'd gathered could have resulted in Greg's immediate termination, possibly Jonathan's as well. But such an approach would have created organizational chaos, destabilizing the very systems I'd spent decades building. What's next for you? Walter asked. The consulting arrangement ends in 3 months. Several board members have mentioned the possibility of creating a chief operations officer position. The question prompted reflection on how fundamentally my perspective had shifted since that day in Greg's office. What had begun as professional humiliation had transformed into an unexpected liberation. I'm not returning to my former role, I said finally, or any traditional executive position. Walter raised an eyebrow. Unexpected. May I ask why? I gestured toward the operations floor visible through the glass walls, where teams were engaged in their daily work. The past months have shown me something important. My greatest contribution isn't managing departments, it's designing systems that function regardless of who manages them. My consulting position had granted me a perspective impossible to achieve from within the traditional hierarchy. I could see patterns, connections, and opportunities invisible from a departmental viewpoint. I'm proposing a different arrangement to the board, I continued. A specialized consulting practice focused on operational system design. Meridian would be my primary client, but not my only one. Walter considered this. You'd have more independence, less security. And greater impact, I added. The problems I've identified at Meridian exist throughout the industry. My solutions could benefit more than one organization. 3 weeks later, the board approved my proposal. My new consulting practice would maintain offices at Meridian headquarters while allowing me to work with select additional clients. The arrangement provided Meridian continued access to my expertise while granting me the freedom to expand my impact beyond a single organization. My final task before transitioning to this new role was selecting my successor within Meridian. Not a direct replacement, the organizational structure had been redesigned, but someone to carry forward the principles of operational integrity I'd established. Ellen was the obvious choice. Her understanding of Meridian's systems, combined with her demonstrated loyalty to operational principles rather than personalities, made her ideal for the role. When I offered her the position, her response was characteristically direct. About time, she said with a slight smile. I've been running half the department for years anyway. She had, of course. Like many women in corporate environments, her contributions had often been overlooked despite their essential nature. My last official day as a Meridian employee arrived with surprising emotional weight. 20 years of identity didn't dissolve easily, despite the exciting possibilities ahead. As I packed the few personal items from my temporary office, Greg appeared in the doorway. His expression was difficult to read, not quite contrite, not entirely hostile. We hadn't spoken directly since the board meeting 3 months earlier. I hear you're leaving, he said finally. Transitioning, I corrected. My new firm will continue working with Meridian. He nodded, awkwardness hanging between us. I wanted to say. He paused, seemingly struggling with the words. The operational frameworks you built. They were more sophisticated than I initially understood. Not quite an apology, but perhaps the closest approximation possible from someone like Greg. They were designed to be adaptable, I replied simply. That's what made them resilient. We didn't shake hands when he left. Some bridges remained partially broken, even after structural repairs. Later that afternoon, I met with my newly formed team at the small but elegant office space I'd leased 3 blocks from Meridian's headquarters. 5 professionals I'd selected specifically for their combination of technical expertise and ethical grounding, including Julie Chun, who had left Meridian during Greg's early days. Our first client meeting is tomorrow, I informed them, distributing detailed briefing materials. A manufacturing firm facing operational challenges similar to what Meridian experienced. As they reviewed the documents, I felt a sense of purpose sharper than anything I'd experienced in years. The termination that had seemed catastrophic had actually been a catalyst, forcing me to reimagine my capabilities outside the constraints of corporate hierarchy. That evening, I stood on my apartment balcony overlooking the city, reflecting on the unexpected journey of the past 6 months. What Greg had intended as an ending had instead become a beginning. His attempt to eliminate a perceived threat had inadvertently created something more powerful, an independent entity governed by principles rather than politics. I had lost a job but gained a calling, lost a title but gained influence, lost predictability but gained potential. The company I'd helped build for 20 years was now stronger for having weathered this challenge. The operational systems I'd created had proven their resilience, and I had discovered capacities within myself previously hidden by the comfortable routines of corporate life. Greg had fired me to save his job, never knowing I had the board's ear. But the real transformation wasn't in proving him wrong or reclaiming what was taken. It was in discovering that what appeared to be an ending was merely a transition to something better than I could have imagined. Sometimes the greatest opportunities arrive disguised as misfortunes. The true measure of resilience isn't in avoiding disruption, but in how we transform in response to it. My 20 years at Meridian had prepared me for this moment, not by teaching me to fight dismissal, but by equipping me to build something more meaningful in its aftermath. As lights blinked on across the cityscape, I felt not the closure of a chapter, but the expansion of possibilities. The path forward was uncharted but compelling. And for the first time in decades, I was walking it entirely on my terms.